Alrighty, welcome back to the Reputation Revolution podcast. Great to have your company. Now, my guest today is Kellie Riordan. She's a leading Australian podcast strategist and creative force behind countless hit shows, including Conversations, which is Australia's most downloaded podcast. As the creative lead of the ABC's podcast team, she has been behind the creation of over 30 shows, including such hits as Unravel True Crime, Judith Lucy's Overwhelmed and Dying, and the intriguingly named The Pineapple Project. So today, Kellie runs her own podcasting consultancy and production outfit called Deadset Studios. Kellie, terrific to have you on the show. Welcome. What were you doing 10 years ago?
Oh, that's such a good question, and I'm so unprepared. Do you know what? Actually, I do know the answer to that. I was about to have a baby 10 years ago because my little girl is 10 in May, so I probably was either... Oh no, she's 11 in May, so I had a baby. I've got two little girls, and I was on maternity leave at that time, and struggling like a lot of working parents to kind of juggle a career and the kids and all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, and earlier days of podcasting. Were you doing anything podcasting back that far?
Yeah, my history in podcasting sort of goes back to the very beginning, actually. And it's because I was working for ABC Radio as a producer. So my background is predominantly in radio, and I've been a journalist, a presenter, a producer for a number of different radio networks. But in 2005, I was working with Richard Fidler, and at that time he was based in Brisbane, where I'm based, and we were doing Conversations, building it from the ground up. And at that stage, the show just went out in Queensland. And a colleague of mine, Ray Allen, a beautiful colleague who's been at the ABC many years, said, this is really great. Like, you're putting a lot of work into the structure of the show. It's a long-form interview. People would really love to listen to this on the internet. And, this is before iPhones and before we were publishing audio to the web, really, 2005. But he and I together, Ray and I, worked out a way that we could publish these MP3 files at that stage to the internet. And I can remember saying to the station manager at the time, can I buy this thing called an iRiver? I don't know if anyone remembers this, but I'm really dating myself now.
Yes. That's a forerunner to the iPhone, to the iPod,
absolutely,
to the iPod, iRiver.
Pre-iPod. That's how old I am. And so I got this iRiver, and I can remember him complaining, "Oh, Kellie, that's a $250 piece of equipment." And I said, "But I need to know if this thing is actually working. We're building this thing called an RSS feed, and I don't really quite understand it, but I've learnt some HTML code." And anyway, Richard Fidler and I joke about how, he'd be in the corner going, "Who's the guest for tomorrow? And have I got a research brief?" And I'd be trying to publish the audio to the internet. And, we started with a couple of hundred people listening, and the show then went national. We continued to create the podcast. Over the years, we've refined and developed it. And then, come sort of, 2020, a long time later, I was running the ABC's podcast team. And so Conversations was still within my purview, a team of 5 people now. It was just Richard and I when we began, still the most downloaded podcast in Australia. So I was there early, but I've done some other things, been overseas, been in radio, been in podcasting. But my first, experience with what we now know as podcasting was definitely in the Wild West days.
I had a podcast I think it was around 08, probably 09, I reckon. And I can't even believe, I don't even know how I put it up. I can't even remember how I did it. So it was very clunky then. There's still a bit behind it, which we'll unpack today. There's still a little bit involved, but the infrastructure around podcasting now is first class, and the tools are all there. So anyone can become their own radio station now, which is terrific, and have their own show. So just quickly, you spent 18 years at the ABC, and for overseas listeners, ABC is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. I was going to say commission. Geez, that would really date me. Australian Broadcasting Corporation, it's the national broadcaster, and very much a leader in podcasting. They were probably the first big media company to be out there and doing it. So 18 years at the ABC, but now you run your own studios and consulting and production of audio. what's it like running your own gig?
Oh my God.
After all that time.
It's frightening and scary and wonderful and terrible. It's all the things.
Well, welcome to entrepreneurship.
Absolutely.
Yeah, what was day one like? You sat at your desk and said, what do I do?
Yeah, and actually the trajectory of how I came there sort of happened really quickly and was actually a bit dramatic. So day one was really intense because I'd made a very quick decision actually to leave the ABC because I had been offered another job establishing another podcast team for another media network. And so I made a very quick decision, but then kind of woke up, sort of made a decision, wrapped up a week and a half later, said goodbye to my team, which was just heartbreaking because they're amazing. They're the best team you'll ever work with. I'm really proud of the work that I did building that team. But, wanted to expand and do different things, and it felt like, podcast is exploding and I'd like to play in some different spaces. But I woke up on the Saturday and I just thought, I've quit this job that I love with a team I love and making podcasts that I'm very, very proud of and that are world renowned. But I'd kind of always wanted to do my own thing and have my own business and run my own show. And, I've had the privilege at the ABC to be able to build a thing from the ground up. And I thought, wouldn't it be fantastic to do that again outside the walls of the ABC? And so I decided not to take that job. And my boss at the ABC in the middle of all this died unexpectedly. So I sort of had to resign to someone who wasn't my boss, and it was horrible. Anyway, I just have always had this sort of hankering to do my own thing. So I woke up on the Saturday, said I'm not going to take that job. Monday morning, sat at my, kitchen table and started working up Deadset Studios. And I just think with everything that's going on in the US around independent production houses really growing and scaling and being the go-to service for media houses, for brands, for advertisers, there's just a real place in the market. And Australia really leads the way in podcasting in terms of some of the tech and the infrastructure that we have here. People like Sharon Taylor at Omni, James Cridlin, who's an international known consultant, is based also in Brisbane. But in terms of content, we've never really had a big player in the market that's creating content independently. And I just thought there was a gap there for me to slip into. And so here I am.
Fantastic, great story, and I always love hearing people's stories about how they go from being long term in corporate to what's it like the day one, and sounds like you had a bit of extra pressure there and a few other things to think about. So tell me, Kellie, let's talk about we both love audio and podcasting and both know the merits of it very, very well, but just in terms of if you're wanting to build a personal brand and that's hosting your own show or whatever that looks like, what are some of the, and we'll probably go between podcasting and audio, because a lot of times people think, podcast audio on demand is podcasting's the big thing, but there are other elements of audio that we're seeing now. We see Clubhouse, for example, has taken off the app. We might talk about that later. But in terms of if someone wanted to build a personal brand and they think audio is the way to go and it would suit them and they'd love to have a crack at it, where do people start? How do we start, and maybe a podcast is the way to go. What's the first things we have to think about if we're going to create a podcast to build a thought leadership positioning in the marketplace?
I think the first thing you really have to sit down and work out sort of what your unique voice and your unique proposition in the market is, because there are now more than 1 million podcasts out there. That's a really tough place to break in. So you have to get really clear about what is your aim with the podcast. Is it the thought leadership space in the industry that you're in? Perhaps you're in the boating manufacturing industry and you want to talk about that. So really thinking about what you bring and the insights that you have and how they are different to others in the market. And I think looking at the market and going, there is no one in the space doing that, or actually there are 10 people in the space doing that, and I have to skew things a little differently, because I think the days of just saying I'm going to open a microphone and just talk, it's too hard to cut through in that way now. You really need to think about, how could I take all of my insights and what I know about my industry and create a different format or something distinctive? And it might be that you go really short form and you might just create 5-minute tips. Or it might be that you have a quiz show where you're imparting information. Like, you really need to think about a format that can gain traction in the market. And I think the other thing is just that authenticity piece, which I know you speak a lot about, but podcasting really is such an intimate medium. There is nothing like opting into having someone in your ears. It's not a background medium. It's something people choose to put in their ears. And so how can you be the most kind of conversational, authentic self? Now, that doesn't mean unprepared. You can still be, an exceptionally authentic and conversational person on a microphone, but be very, very prepared and sharp and have a really clear plan in your mind. But just thinking about who you are behind a microphone. And also, I think the last thing I would say is, what's your measure of success? Because I think people start a podcast thinking, I've got to get, hundreds of thousands of listeners. That might not be your measure of success. If you are the boating manufacturing expert in Australia and all you need to do is talk to the people who want to buy a boat, then that might only be 1,000 people in Australia. But if you can get to that 1,000 people, which is what podcasting does so well, deep engagement with a niche, then I think that is something to think about, and to not get... I see a lot of people start and then think if they don't have broad audience, they've failed. Yep. It's not about that. It's about deep connection with your specific audience.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think people are besotted with numbers, and it's not the big number, it's the right number for the niche. And you do have to go more and more niche, I think, today. And podcasting is a narrowcast in that regard, isn't it? I mean, it allows you to go deep into one topic if you should, choose to do so. You might be known for a number of things, but your podcast might just be focused on one area of what you do. And as you say, when people, I think there's, for people to subscribe or opt in to listen to you for half an hour, that's a privileged position to be in. And I think it's, you know a lot of podcasters, it probably happened to yourself. People come up to you, I've been listening to you for years and I feel like I know you. And you hear that all the time from people who run podcasts when they go to an event. When in days when we'd go to an event and people say, I listened to you for so long. And there's that intimacy, as you said. So you mentioned a couple of formats. No one's ever thrown quizzes at me here. I've never even thought of quizzes. There we go. What's some different formats that people, let's think expansively. How can we run a podcast, where I enjoy this one-on-one conversation, and it's obviously a very popular one. But what other ones are there? What other formats do you see out there? And let's add quizzes in there.
I know, so exciting. I think people, when they're new to podcasting, don't really understand what a format is. They still think a podcast is what we're doing, two people sitting at microphones and talking. And that can be a podcast, obviously. But I think what we're seeing, particularly in what I'm calling kind of podcast 3.0, which is the moment we're in at the moment. If you think about 1.0 being that infancy when it just got going, sort of in 2004, I think the second phase of podcasting was really that 2014 moment where you had a happy collision of, Serial, the big blockbuster podcast, come out from the team at This American Life at the very same time that Apple put that purple podcast button native on every iPhone. Those two things happening at the same time meant it exploded. What you're seeing now in podcast 3.0 is a maturing of the market, and some of that is around format and Hollywood getting involved. Because if you think about television, Gogglebox is a format. So the format is, we film people sitting in their lounge room watching TV and hear what they think about what they're watching on the television. That's a format. It's different to just two people talking to each other.
Correct.
My Dad Wrote a Porno, a very famous podcast. 3 comedians, they read the porn novel written by one of their dads. So they read the novel chapter by chapter and kind of take the mickey out of it along the way. That's a format. Panel shows, quiz shows, pantomimes, scripted content. We're seeing a lot more in the fiction scripted space now. Like, what is a movie that's made for your ears? If you look at, Q Code, a great podcast outfit in America doing all sorts of amazing scripted content now, like Carrier. They're really getting into the space of like, what is a Hollywood blockbuster movie done for your ears? And I think that is so exciting.
Wow.
Really great. We have a show at the ABC called Short and Curly, which is a show about ethics for kids. And it has a really distinctive format in that there's 2 hosts, Carl and Molly, And they kind of have a little pantomime at the beginning. So there's a little scene where they're interacting about a conundrum. And it's kind of like, oh, should we really kill animals and eat them? Like, is that ethically dubious? And then they're joined by an ethicist who plays the role of like unpacking the ethics for them. There's a cute little pause function where we say, hit pause now and discuss this ethical conundrum with your family. And we give them some thinking music. There's an element that we call the Brains Trust, where we go into schools and we interview kids about what they think of this ethical conundrum. And so you can see how put together that is a format that isn't two people behind a microphone just talking. So there are so many great formats now that are really exciting, and that's the experimentation that we're seeing in this, what I'm calling Podcast 3.0.
Yeah, lovely. There's just a whole stack right there, isn't there? And I think if we look at live streaming as not a subset of podcasting, but a lot of live streams now, a lot of podcasters are live streaming their show for starters. But what I'm seeing a trend is that people who have been doing live streams are now doing actual shows with intros and guests, serious digital marketing things, but they've got a magician. Yeah. Or I saw one the other day where they've got it's almost like the Tonight Show, and they got a keyboardist and he pops in and introduces things. It was almost like, some of the, who was the guy? One of the ones? Jay Leno, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, it's like a variety hour,
but it's a business. It's a business marketing show. And even now, I'm now, we're recording video as well. So this is sort of video as well. So, it's crossing boundaries left, right and centre. But, when you see the live streaming shows that are like an hour long and everything, there's no reason why you couldn't do that just audio only too, which takes, one layer of difficulty out. And then you can produce it on your own. Now you've got a leadership podcast called Curveball, and got some terrific guests on there. The recent one, Adam Grant, pretty high profile. You've had Kate Morris, who's the cosmetics queen in Australia, who's got a listed company. Her company's called Adore.
Adore Beauty, yeah. She's done amazing things to float that company.
Yeah. That was a great interview. That you've taken, but it feels really fresh the way you do it. Can you walk us through? And I recommend people listen to Curveball, subscribe, have a listen to it. But that's an interview show, but it feels fresher than most.
Thank you. That's really lovely to hear. I think what I've done with that show, that one's made kind of on the smell of an oily rag compared to some of the budgets I was working with at the ABC. But I wanted to take still some of the hallmarks and qualities of the way we produce things at the ABC and bring them to Curveball. So one of the things I did with Conversations in the early days was we came up with a brief structure or a narrative arc across an hour, because if you're interviewing someone for that length of time, it has to have stakes, it has to have plot points, it has to have moments of highs and lows, and you need to think really carefully about how you place those moments so that you've got interest and intrigue across the whole interview. So the producers that work with me on that show, Hannah Kinder and Rachel Fountain, who are excellent, help me put together a research brief, and we really think a lot and spend a lot of time prepping on, what has Kate Morris not talked about before, and what are some of the high points we need to hit, and does it make sense if we go from this point to that point? And so we put a lot of effort into that. In terms of the production, it's a fairly low level of production in some respects, but we know how to use music effectively. We know how to structure an intro that's really story-led. I think this is the other thing. A lot of the workshops I do with up-and-coming podcasters and people in the brand space, they follow the what I call radio tropes of sort of 1975, which is they open the microphone and they say, "Hi, I'm Kellie Riordan, and joining me on the line today is my guest, Trevor Young." And that's actually not compelling. So what I try to do is tell a story up front. So to open the microphone and say, when Kate Morris was 21, she was sitting in her garage packing boxes of cosmetics on her own with $12,000 her boyfriend's dad has, lent to her. And she remembers the moment she burst into tears and thought, I cannot keep going. And it's already, you're on the journey, right? You're not turning off. Yeah. So I just bring a story-led approach and some production values. We insist on proper microphones and studio quality, and we don't do things on the phone and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, and it tells, and you've got sponsors and stuff like that too. So it's that's one way now is you can help with costs of production by having sponsors if you're building your audience. And one thing that I do here, I know a few people do. You have that snippet at the front. I probably used to just go straight into intros and stuff, but now I have a snippet of the interview because I've enjoyed listening to someone's snippet before I listen to the full thing, and if I gravitate to what they're saying in that 30 seconds or 20 seconds, then I'll give the rest of it a crack. And I think that's not a bad way of doing it as well. Yep. Gives people a bit of a teaser at least.
Yeah, we do that because in every interview, when I finish with someone, there's this one piece of gold, something that they've said that has just made my jaw drop. And so why wouldn't I put that up front, And the curveball is about the guests. It's kind of not about me. It's about the guests and their journey. And so if they have a moment that's particularly compelling. The other thing about curveball, because it is with top leaders from around the world, and we do have a kill rate as well, where we might scope out a guest and we might do some research and have a phone call with them and then realise actually they don't tick enough of the story matrix for us, and so we won't go ahead with the interview. And not everyone's in that position to be able to do that. But because we do that, we know we've got people with a great story, and then that's why I know there's going to be an incredible quote at some point. And also the guests have been incredibly generous and candid about the tough times, because my aim with Curveball was it's not just the shiny, amazing moments where you float your company for $600 million. There were moments when Kate Morris mortgaged herself to the eyeballs to take on this risky strategy. She said she was depressed in the early days. Like, the leaders on the show have told you about the highs and lows of running your own business or leading a company.
Yeah, and you're right. And the having the seeing that's the transformation, isn't it? Often they're successful people, but we want to hear the hard times and the lessons they've learned from along the way, which that's the value from us, and then the stories bring it to life. So just zeroing back into we're looking at creating a podcast. We're niching down. We're looking at our audience clearly, who's zeroing in on our audience and what's going to be of interest and relevance to them. Where do we take it from there? Formats, I suppose we just discussed about, but that's something that's, probably takes a little bit of work and a lot of research to work out what and how capable you are of being able to produce that. But then how do people, what do you suggest to people just in the earlier days of getting going, not to be too ambitious or?
Oh, no, have ambitions, absolutely, and have energy. Creating a podcast is a lot of work, and, I talk to people about the difference in radio. When you made a radio show, which I did for a long time, making daily radio, the minute at which you go to air, your job is kind of largely done. Whereas with podcasts, the minute you've created the thing, you're only at the halfway point, because you've got to write show notes and you've got to think about how to distribute it, and you've got to think about your social sell and your digital sell. And so there's a lot to it. But there's some really simple things that people can do. As you can see in the background, I'm very obsessed with sticky note planning. And so just having a plan or a pre-production process can really save you time. So, we talk about format, but I always also talk about casting. Like, are you the best host for what you're trying to do, or is someone else a better host? Should you be helping leverage their voice? Maybe it's a double header. Think about the casting of the type of people you're going to have on your show. Like, what do they bring as a character? What is it about that person that makes them a compelling interview for you? Yeah. And starting to also look at that holistically. So why I do the sticky note exercise is it helps me go, on Curveball, I've had, 3 people in a row who are all from sport. That doesn't make sense. I should move one of those episodes back and have someone from the arts or someone from politics. So
curation.
It's the curation.
Guest curation, yeah.
And thinking about, the other thing I really advise people when they're starting off is kind of just bite off what you can chew, because don't set out to do a podcast 52 weeks of the year if you're going to run out of steam at episode 4. Maybe you should just aim for one series of 10 episodes and plan that 10 episodes out, because you find efficiencies in production then if you're just sort of doing that. You can sort of bulk up your recording phase and you can send things to an editor in one bulk instead of week by week. So start start with something containable for you. Everyone doesn't have the resource of a big media outfit behind them. So just look at what's doable for you and how much time you really have and how much you need to partner with other experts, a sound engineer or a producer or something like that.
Yep.
And just do that. And if that works and it's sustainable, do another 10. But I think too many people start without thinking about what the end game is.
Indeed, and what you want to achieve from it as well, what you're wanting to get out of it, and what's the message that you want people to take out from that. I guess it's interesting you said that do a 10-pack. I've noticed more in recent years that people are going to seasons because podcasting every week, as I can attest,
it's draining.
There's a fair bit. It comes around really quickly. I'm now well organised, whereas, in previous years I may have had to scramble a little bit, and that's not the most ideal. It's better to plan it. I'm much more planned now. I've got it well in advance, and I know what's coming up, for the next 6 weeks. So that takes a lot of pressure off, and it allows you to enjoy the moment a lot more, I think.
It also respects, I think, sorry to interrupt you there, but I think it also respects your audience's time. Like, don't give them something that's hacked together because you thought it's Tuesday and I always release something on a Tuesday. Like, as an audience member, I think finishability is a thing. Like, I don't like podcasts where I feel overwhelmed by the volume of content and I can't even keep up. So I think you're much better to say, I value your time, and so I'm only going to bring you episodes when they're good and worth putting into the world. So I think, people need to shift their thinking on that as well. And your audience might be completely happy for a monthly episode because that's kind of all they need, and that's all that you've got, and that's the time that you've got, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. The economics around podcasting skew towards high volume, but if you're not doing it for that reason, if you're doing it for market value, getting your brand out there, getting your personal thought leadership into the space, you've got a different sort of parameter. There's nothing wrong with a fortnightly release. There's nothing wrong with a monthly release.
Yeah. I think the key, though, then is consistency. If you are going to be on the first of the month, come out at the first of the month so you can become part of their habit. I think the only other thing that I've learned along the journey working with others doing it is that, if you're going to launch, have, 3 or 4 in the bag. So if people enjoy it, they can go back again. One thing I know, a number of media companies, not the ABC, I don't think, but media companies, they do this massive promotion and everything, and then they put out a trailer, and then you wait 3 months for the first episode, and then you've forgotten it. It's just, whereas if they promote it, it's out there, you listen to one, I love this, and you go, there's back catalogue, fantastic, and then it's about habit, isn't it? Getting people into the habit. And so in terms of, I guess you mentioned the tech, and there are people to help you. And interestingly, I did a podcast years ago with someone, I reckon it must have been about 2010. And we went into a radio studio and we got one of the journalists there to interview, or one of the presenters to interview the client, because the client didn't want to interview others. He was the absolute expert at what he did, and he didn't want to sit there and just riff straight in because it's, he just didn't want to, and that's really hard, as you know, just to run solo on an episode. And we got someone to interview him. And that's what you were saying before. You might not be the best person to host. Yep. Get someone else to host, and they interview you as the expert, draw the insights and the ideas and the stories and the lessons out of your head, because that's what they're experienced to do.
Can I give you a really good example of that helps bring that to life? Because I couldn't agree with you more. When we were creating the Pineapple Project that you mentioned at the beginning of the show, so this is a series that the ABC did, or still does, where we help mostly women in their 30s and 40s sort something out in their life. It's sort of an adult hacks show. And the first series was all about money, like how to be better with money, plan, budget, save, all those things. And it's very much aimed at women who, aren't necessarily on top of that. Like, you're not a financial expert. And when the team were sort of ideating on what the show should be, they kept coming to me and saying, we've spoken to this financial expert who could be the host, or this really great author who's written the book on, how to plan and blah, blah, blah. And I just said to them, that's actually not who we want to host this, because that person is going to speak in jargon, they're very knowledgeable, et cetera, and it's not going to work for our target audience. So instead, the executive producer at the time, Monique Bowley, who's fantastic, and Rachel Fountain, who was working on it, came up with the idea of casting a comedian, Claire Hooper, who's this kind of wet mess when it comes to money, and she's a train wreck, and she doesn't have any money saved up, and she's got 2 kids, and she can't afford school fees and all of that. And so by casting her, she could play the role of like the audience. Like, how do I do this? How do you do a budget? How do you plan? Like, what's superannuation, and how do I know I've got enough of it? And how do I budget for a wedding or whatever I need to afford? So she could play the role of the audience, and then the experts could bring their advice to her. So you as the audience member felt like you weren't being talked down to or lectured, or someone smarter than you was telling you what to do. That show is funny, accessible, relevant, a huge hit. And that's the way you need to think in terms of casting, I think, for podcasts.
I love that story. That's terrific. Yes, I think that, and it's really breaking open now. I mean, for many years it was pretty, the podcasting space was, someone had come out with a course on podcasting who was successful, and then everyone had just repeat that blueprint in the vain hope of having an instant success. And I think sometimes now the opportunities are to collaborate with others, to the technology's there, whether you're live streaming or not, or whether you want to do video or not, and do you could do micro podcasts, you can do a whole stack of other things. Let's open it up a little bit then to audio generally. Where it's a pretty golden age for audio at the moment. It's really just cracking open. And what I love about audio and podcasting is it's never been really hockey stick growth. It's just been steady. And if you look at the research of how people consume, when people discover podcasts, they embrace it and they listen to a lot of podcasts. So it's not hockey stick growth, but it's really solid now, and it's real. The penetration, I mean, it's very, very mainstream. But do you think now there are other opportunities for audio, for people to use audio in innovative ways? Because now we're used to, listening to podcasts. It's been the forerunner. What are some other ways we could use audio on demand content?
I absolutely agree with all of that. If you look at most of the statistics around audience consumption of podcasts in Australia, it's roughly, 30-35% of the population listening regularly. But of that 30%, they are nuts for it. They listen to 6 episodes a week. When you think about the length of a podcast often being kind of 35 to 55 minutes long, that's a lot of time. It's highly sticky, and it's a deep engagement with the audience. So that is really encouraging. But what that has meant is that people are now used to this habit of listening to audio not via a radio in the corner that they turn the dial on or a button in their car. They now understand they've got a radio in their pocket. It's called a mobile phone. And via that mobile phone, they can listen to a podcast, they can listen to live radio via an app, they can get on Clubhouse and listen to a couple of people talking about something. Smart speakers, I think, are really going to change the way we consider information absorption. I know myself, as soon as I got a smart speaker, and yes, I can say, hey, play me ABC Brisbane, and it'll bring up the radio station, but I'll also ask it like sort of utility questions. And I think brands and kind of utility companies have got a real opportunity to jump into that audio space, so that I can say, hey, Google, how am I going with my power bill this month? And it says, you're at 87% of your usual monthly, and if you build that in a really conversational way, that sense of audio answering questions about your life, I think, could potentially explode. My kids are really used to asking, Google or Alexa, quiz questions, trivia, those sorts of things. We're seeing Alexa build skills around particular podcasts. We saw a great experimentation with Gimlet. They have a little podcast called Chompers, and it's all about brushing your teeth, and they built a little audio skill where you could say to your speaker, please bring up Chompers, and it would go for the 2 minutes that you say kids have to brush their teeth for. So jumping into the space around...
That is brilliant.
Isn't it? So clever.
That's brilliant.
But it's that utility piece. So how can you use audio to slip into people's lives around the things that they need to know or do in their everyday life? I think we've always thought of audio as entertainment or information, but I think the next way we'll see it integrating into our car dashboards and our, speakers in our home and our refrigerators that are going to be smarter than us pretty soon, will be that audio can tell you things. Because you can't, I don't know about you, but I kind of like audio telling me those things because I'm still doing something else. So I'm chopping the carrots and I'm saying, how's my power bill going? Instead of sitting down, logging onto my computer, bringing up the app with my power bill, blah, blah, blah. It's like a pain. Yeah. Audio can just give you stuff while you're doing something else. And I'm kind of bullish on this because I had a terrible RSI injury where, at the extreme end, really had a lot of trouble with my wrists and elbows, ended up having surgery, all sorts of things. So there was a period of time I had to withdraw from keyboards. And I started using voice and experimenting with, can I voice my text? Can I voice my calendar? Can I voice my emails to people? And that really opened my eyes to the opportunity around just using your voice to ask for things that we're used to Googling.
Yeah. And that's, the smart speakers takes it into a whole new ball game. And I guess from a podcasting point of view, can you, make sure that your podcast is ready for speakers? And that's a whole new thing. In terms of production as well, and I like the utility too. I think that, particularly if you're someone who is an expert, you can set yourself up I'm the expert in this space. Put me on the smart speaker, however that works, and then the people who specialise in that, and then people can ask you those questions.
I mean, imagine. I think we can be so creative with this. Imagine, like Garmin have the Garmin watch where you go and track via GPS how far you've run. So I can look on my phone at the app and go, I ran 3Ks today, and each lap was roughly 5.5 minutes. But what if I could just say, hey Google, how far did I run today? And I heard Usain Bolt, his voice come on and go, hey Kelly, you're doing really great with your running. You ran 3Ks and each lap was 5 minutes 25, but you were a bit slower on lap number 3. I think brands have such an opportunity to grab onto subject matter specialists and use them to impart utility information in a way that is going to blow open the audio space.
Seeing on new ideas and stuff. I mean, just let's riff a couple of things on a few things around audio. I mean, I've got a blog called PR Warrior, and on that I have audio, so you can now listen to the, and it's all AI. I don't touch it; it just appears, which is even better. I don't have to do anything to it, and you can listen to the article instead of read it. I've heard a few people in the past, probably more digital marketers, but they've read their articles. They were, doing a lot of articles. They read them and put them up on a podcast. So they're, anywhere between 3 and 4 minutes long per article, which I think sometimes good. Your train rides, 35 minutes. The podcast's 30 minutes, and I've got another 5 minutes to go. What else can I listen to? So those short bites, those short, I don't know what you call them, those bite-sized podcasts. More often, but just lots less of them. There's room for that. And another one I really like is an audio white paper. A lot of experts and companies, but experts create white papers around a particular topic that they go in depth. Why not do an audio version? And that's when you can do the narrative and you can interview people and you can make it this, it could be a half an hour audio white paper.
I love all of these ideas. It's no surprise that one of the tech companies that the New York Times has bought is a company that uses AI to transform their long-form New York Times articles into, audio. And so it does. It's not a podcast. I mean, it's an audio file, so I guess it is a podcast, but it is essentially just somebody reading a long-form article. I think that's interesting. I think Slate in America, one of the initial people who set up their podcast team, Andy Bowers, who's done a whole lot of interesting things in podcasting, he started at Slate by buying a microphone, sitting in a chair, reading the long 3,000-word Slate articles and putting it out as audio, 12 years ago. And then that got them into podcasting, where they actually make proper podcasts that are fit for purpose for the podcast space. And then you're seeing people like Pushkin, which is the production company that Malcolm Gladwell, the author, runs, and they are doing some really exciting things about blurring what an audio book is and what a podcast is and sort of putting the two things together. So you're hearing Malcolm read parts of his book, but then he might have interviewed someone for the book, and you'll actually hear the audio, a section of that interview, and maybe with some sound design, and suddenly you've got this real blend of it's no longer just a book where Malcolm literally reads the words on the page. It's much more immersive, and I think those sorts of technologies and ideas are quite exciting.
Wow. I'll have to go and check that out.
Yeah.
I'll have to check that out. I mean, it's this mashup now. So I guess if I can sort of wrap up the show with, there was the basics we got through about knowing your audience, and certainly going into your niche and working out whether there is a niche for you and that sort of things, working out formats. I mean, clearly this is a popular one that I'm doing now, but there are other ones, or if you don't want to be the host, you can get someone to interview you. There's so many things there. There's people you might need on your team. There are a lot of people out there, freelancers, who can edit your podcast. So if you don't want to do the tech side of it and that back end, which can be time consuming, they are certainly around to help you on that regard. The technology is a lot easier today, where I'm using Riverside. There's things like Zencaster. Some people use Zoom. Some people use Squadcast. So there's those types of technology. And the microphones, are pretty cheap and very powerful today as well. So everything's there for people to do. I guess that last part of the conversation around think more expansively. Like, there's so many creative ways. Just listen to a whole stack of different podcasts, not necessarily in your space. Hear how the narrative side works. Listen to Curveball, Kellie's podcast, and how she has that narrative arc in a traditional interview style. The Malcolm Gladwell one, the guys from Gimlet Media and what they're doing. It might be as simple as jumping on Clubhouse and just getting a feel for audio and maybe hosting a room at some point. And that way you're actually moderating and hosting, and that's a forerunner to podcasting. So, and at the very least, maybe jump onto some of these apps where you can do audio for social media, put it up on Twitter.
That's right.
And Twitter has now got Twitter Spaces, which is kind of like Clubhouse. So even if the smallest start, don't jump straight into a podcast, but perhaps get onto audio on social media is a really good way to start developing your voice literally and figuratively.
I think that's right. And I think also just a bit of planning and getting a little bit of advice from people who know what they're doing at the outset, because some of the organisations I've worked with, I just do some very low-cost, short workshops where, you might spend 2 or 3 hours with me really honing your idea, and I give you a whole lot of expertise around production schedules and resources and the way you should be story-led and things. Just doing that work has completely transformed the way a lot of these organisations think about what they're doing with podcasting. And in the same way that I would never go and ride a motorbike tomorrow without going and having a lesson with someone who knows how to ride motorbikes. Like, I just wouldn't. That's crazy. And I see a lot of people actually waste money and time and resource because they didn't do the good thinking up front. And so, find those people who really know about the medium. You can spend a very small amount of money to get some good advice, and then that just sets you on a path and opens your mind to all of these different ways that you can do things. Because I do find in the age of DIY, I can be a blogger, I can be a YouTube star, I can be a podcaster, and I love that. Like, I love the democratized version of podcasting, in that everyone can have a microphone and anyone deserves a voice. I love that. I love that a kid in regional Western Australia in Kununurra who's Indigenous can have a podcast. Like, that is so great. But I also think the flip side is, let's make good things, put good things into the world. And the best way to do that is to get some good thinking up front.
Yeah, pretty good advice there, Kellie. Thank you very much for your time, and really have loved dissecting podcasting and all things audio. Where's the best place for people to find you online? So
Deadset Studios is my company, and we are both a podcast production house where we can actually produce shows for people, and we're also a consultancy, so we do give small pieces of advice, or I'm also working with big media houses as well and everything in between. So we're just deadsetstudios.com. Deadset Studios is also on Twitter and Instagram, so you can always find me on those channels. I'm on LinkedIn as well, just under my name, Kellie Riordan.
Fantastic. Cheers. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me, Trevor. Good luck with the rest of your podcast. I'm really pleased to be part of it.
Thank you very much.